The Vietnam War was one of the most brutal and complex conflicts of the 20th century, lasting from 1955 to 1975. It was a war of guerrilla tactics, dense jungles, and unconventional strategies. But amidst the chaos, armored vehicles like tanks played a crucial role, both for the United States and North Vietnamese forces. Tanks, despite the challenging terrain, became symbols of power and destruction. They were deployed in daring operations, providing support to ground troops and spearheading assaults in harsh environments. Each side adapted their vehicles to the unique conditions of Vietnam, making the battlefields unpredictable. If you're enjoying this dive into military history and want to support us, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're aiming for 500 subscribers, and your support means the world to us. Let's dive deeper. Now let's explore how these mechanical beasts shaped the Vietnam War. M48 Patton, the mainstay of U.S. forces. The M48 Patton was the principal tank of the U.S. Army and Marine Corps during the Vietnam War, named after General George S. Patton. This medium tank was built to counter Soviet armor in Europe, but was adapted for the challenges of Southeast Asia. Weighing over 49 tons and armed with a 90mm main gun, the M48 was a formidable machine. In Vietnam, the M48's primary role was not tank-to-tank combat, as the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, had limited armored capabilities early in the war. Instead, the Patton was used for infantry support, convoy security, and base defense. Its powerful gun provided precise firepower, and its .50 caliber machine gun made it effective against infantry. One significant challenge was terrain. The M48 often struggled with Vietnam's dense jungles, muddy rice paddies, and narrow roads. Tank crews frequently modified their vehicles with additional track segments as armor and jungle-clearing equipment like plows. Despite its size, the Patton proved valuable in battles like Hue during the Tet Offensive, where its firepower was crucial in dislodging entrenched NVA forces. M41 Walker Bulldog, Speed and Reconnaissance. The M41 Walker Bulldog, designed for speed and maneuverability, was a stark contrast to the heavier M48. Introduced in the 1950s, the Bulldog was intended for reconnaissance and light support roles. It was equipped with a 76mm gun and could reach speeds of up to 72 kilometers per hour, 45 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest tanks of its era. In Vietnam, the Bulldog excelled in quick skirmishes and scouting missions. Its smaller size allowed it to traverse narrower jungle paths and engage in hit-and-run attacks against Viet Cong positions. However, its relatively thin armor made it vulnerable to RPGs and mines, which the Viet Cong used extensively. Despite these vulnerabilities, the Bulldog's speed and agility made it a favorite among some tank crews. Its role in Vietnam highlighted the importance of light tanks in unconventional warfare, where speed and adaptability often outweighed brute strength. M113 Armored Personnel Carrier, the workhorse. The M113 Armored Personnel Carrier, APC, became a symbol of U.S. mechanized warfare in Vietnam. Unlike traditional tanks, the M113 was primarily designed to transport troops safely through hostile territory. Its lightweight aluminum armor protected against small arms fire and shrapnel, while its tracks allowed it to traverse challenging terrain. What made the M113 truly versatile was its adaptability. Crews often mounted additional weapons, such as grenade launchers and machine guns, transforming it into a mobile weapons platform. The vehicle's open-top design allowed soldiers to fire from within, providing a 360-degree defensive capability. The M113 was essential in operations like the Battle of Ap Bac, where U.S. forces used it to transport troops into enemy-held territory. It also played a critical role in medevac missions, saving countless lives by quickly evacuating wounded soldiers from the battlefield. However, the M113 was not without flaws. Its thin armor made it vulnerable to RPGs, and its open-top design left troops exposed to ambushes. Still, its contributions to the war effort were immense, earning it the nickname Green Dragon among Vietnamese troops for its resilience and firepower. PT-76, Master of Amphibious Warfare. The PT-76 was a Soviet-designed light tank renowned for its amphibious capabilities. Lightweight and compact, it was ideal for the rivers, deltas and wetlands that characterized much of Vietnam's terrain. With a 76.2mm main gun and a crew of 3, the PT-76 was not heavily armored, but was highly maneuverable. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, utilized the PT-76 strategically, often in areas where U.S. forces least expected tank operations. Its ability to cross rivers and streams allowed it to launch surprise attacks. For example, during the Battle of Ben Het in 1969, PT-76 tanks spearheaded a North Vietnamese assault on a U.S. firebase, forcing American forces to rely on airstrikes to repel the attack. Despite its advantages, the PT-76 had limitations. Its thin armor made it vulnerable to U.S. anti-tank weapons, and its main gun was ineffective against the heavier M48 Patton. Nevertheless, the PT-76's role in the Vietnam War demonstrated the value of light, amphibious tanks in unconventional warfare. T-54/T-55, the Soviet powerhouses. The T-54 and T-55 tanks, also supplied by the Soviet Union, represented the backbone of the NVA's armored forces. These medium tanks were heavily armed with a 100mm gun and well protected with sloped armor. Compared to the PT-76, the T-54/T-55 was better suited for direct engagements and offensive operations. While initially used sparingly, these tanks became more prominent in the later stages of the war. One of their most famous appearances was during the 1975 Fall of Saigon, when T-54 tanks breached the gates of the presidential palace, marking the end of the conflict. This moment became an enduring image of North Vietnamese victory. The NVA used T-54/T-55 tanks cautiously, often deploying them in mixed-unit tactics with infantry and artillery. Their firepower and durability made them formidable opponents, even against U.S. air support. However, their reliance on supply lines and roads limited their effectiveness in Vietnam's dense jungles and mountainous regions. Vietnam's terrain was a nightmare for traditional tank warfare. Dense jungles, narrow roads, and swampy fields often rendered tanks immobile or easy targets for ambushes. Both sides had to adapt. For the Americans, tank crews worked closely with infantry to clear jungle paths and secure roads. The use of bulldozer-equipped tanks helped create makeshift routes through the wilderness. Additionally, air mobility became essential. Helicopters like the Chinook were sometimes used to transport smaller vehicles across impassable terrain. The NVA relied on ingenuity and guerrilla tactics. They used tanks primarily in surprise attacks and ambushes, avoiding prolonged engagements. They also built extensive networks of tunnels and bunkers, forcing U.S. forces to rely heavily on close-quarters combat. Despite these adaptations, tanks were not always the decisive factor. The environment often reduced their effectiveness, highlighting the unique challenges of the Vietnam War. Key battles involving tanks. Tanks played decisive roles in several key battles during the Vietnam War. One of the most notable was the Battle of Hue during the Tet Offensive. The city of Hue, held by the North Vietnamese, became a bloody battleground as U.S. forces fought to reclaim it. M48 Pattons were brought in to support infantry, blasting through fortified positions and providing cover for advancing troops. Their firepower proved instrumental in retaking the city after weeks of intense fighting. Another example was the Battle of Lang Vei in 1968, where the NVA used PT-76 tanks in a surprise attack on a US Special Forces camp. The defenders, caught off guard by the presence of tanks, struggled to repel the assault. This marked one of the few instances where North Vietnamese armor achieved a decisive victory against American forces. Later in the war, during the 1972 Easter Offensive, North Vietnam deployed large numbers of T-54/T-55 tanks. These battles highlighted the growing sophistication of NVA tactics and the increasing reliance on Soviet-supplied armor, limitations of tanks in guerrilla warfare. Despite their impact, tanks faced significant limitations in Vietnam. The guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong and NVA often rendered traditional tank strategies ineffective. Dense jungles and narrow trails restricted movement, leaving tanks vulnerable to ambushes. The Viet Cong used anti-tank mines, RPGs, and even homemade explosives to devastating effect. One infamous example occurred during the Battle of Dak To, where US tanks were ambushed on a narrow jungle trail. Hidden Viet Cong forces used RPGs to disable several M48 Pattons, leaving them stranded and exposed. Such incidents highlighted the vulnerability of tanks in an environment where mobility and concealment were critical. Legacy of tanks in Vietnam. The legacy of tanks in the Vietnam War lies in the lessons they taught about unconventional warfare. While tanks were not always decisive, they showcased the importance of adaptability in challenging environments. The conflict highlighted the need for lighter, more maneuverable vehicles and the integration of air and ground forces. Today, many of the tactics and strategies developed in Vietnam continue to influence modern armored warfare, emphasizing the need for flexibility in diverse combat scenarios. Tanks played a significant but complicated role in the Vietnam War. For the Americans, vehicles like the M48 Patton and M113 APC were essential tools, providing firepower and mobility. For the North Vietnamese, tanks like the PT-76 and T-54 symbolized resilience and ingenuity. However, the dense jungles and guerrilla tactics often neutralize the advantages of tanks. Their legacy lies in the adaptability and determination of the crews who operated them, as well as the evolving tactics of modern warfare. If you enjoyed this exploration of military history, make sure to subscribe. Your support helps us reach our goal of 500 subscribers and allows us to bring you more content like this. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.